Welcome to The Explainer. So, when you're deep in the weeds of international compliance, it's super easy to treat a standard like ISO 17025 as a standalone book, right? Like you just pull it off the shelf, read it cover to cover, and boom, you're compliant. Well, as you probably already know, the reality is a whole lot more complicated. International standards absolutely do not exist in a vacuum. They form this incredibly dense, highly interconnected web of dependencies. Today, we're going to decode that web by zeroing in on one very specific mechanism, normative references, and we'll use ISO/IEC 17025 as our roadmap.
Now, talking about abstract rules and ISO guidelines can sound a bit dry on the surface, just a bunch of numbers and acronyms. But let's be real. These standards govern high-stakes physical environments. We're talking about making sure a firefighter's gear holds up to extreme heat, or ensuring medical diagnostic tools are perfectly calibrated. In these scenarios, precision literally saves lives. And to get that level of precision, you need an absolutely unshakable foundation of rules.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our agenda for today. First, behind the standard. Second, what are normative references? Third, the mandatory vocabularies. Fourth, normative versus informative. And finally, the compliance takeaway. Starting right off with Section 1, behind the standard, the foundation of ISO/ISO 17025. So before we can map out this hidden web, we gotta establish what's at the center of it all. Precision in a laboratory directly translates to safety and reliability out in the physical world. And ISO/IEC 17025, well, that's the core standard. It lays out the general requirements for the competence of testing and calibration labs. It's the absolute gold standard. If a lab wants to prove their test results are trustworthy, this is the rulebook they use. But here's the catch. That rulebook is not self-contained. It's actually a lot like a software dependency. Think about it. You can't run a complex computer program without having the base code installed, right? It's the exact same deal with international standards. When you adopt one standard, you're actually adopting a whole underlying network of rules. If you just read the main text of ISO 17025 and totally ignore the background code it relies on, your entire compliance program is going to crash. Which brings us to Section 2. What are normative references? The hidden dependencies. Let's look at Clause 2 of the standard, which is literally titled Normative References. The standard officially defines these as documents referred to in the text in such a way that some or all of their content constitutes requirements of the document itself. Let that sink in for a second. These are not suggestions. They aren't just recommended reading for extra credit. They are mandatory foundational blocks. If a document is listed as a normative reference, you have to follow its rules just as strictly as the rules in the main standard. No exceptions. But here's a question. How do you know exactly which version of a reference document you're supposed to use? Well, the standard is super precise about version control. If it gives you a dated reference, like it specifically lists a year, then only that exact cited edition applies, period. It doesn't matter if 10 new versions come out later. On the flip side, if it's an undated reference, the latest edition, along with any new amendments, applies automatically. This setup is brilliant because it ensures labs always know precisely which rules they are bound to, saving everyone from massive compliance headaches down the line. Moving right along to Section 3. The mandatory vocabularies, the two required keys for ISO 17025. So, Clause 2 of ISO 17025 specifically points out two undated normative references. First up is ISO/IIC Guide 99, which is the International Vocabulary of Metrology, or what we usually call the VIM. And second is ISO/IIC 17000, covering conformity assessment vocabulary and general principles. These two specific documents are absolute prerequisites. You literally cannot claim to comply with ISO 17025 or even fully understand it without strictly adhering to the definitions laid out in these two external guides. You can really see this in action when you hit Clause 3 of ISO 17025. Now, Clause 3 is typically where a standard defines its own terms, but here, it essentially just delegates the job. As you can see, Clause 3 relies entirely on those two normative references we just talked about to define its vocabulary. It's a completely seamless handoff from one document to another, and it perfectly illustrates just how deeply integrated this web of standards really is. All right, Section 4, normative versus informative, the mandatory versus the optional. Okay, so if some external documents are absolutely mandatory, what about all the others mentioned in the standard? We've got to draw a really clear line here. On one side, we have our normative references from Clause 2,
Those are the mandatory documents that form strict requirements for compliance. But on the other side, we have the bibliography, which hangs out in the informative annexes at the very end of the document. These are completely optional. They're just supplementary documents listed to give you some extra context. If you actually flip to the back of the ISO 17025 document, you're going to find this huge bibliography. It actually contains 24 distinct items. We're talking massive, heavy-hitting standards, like ISO 9000 for quality management systems and ISO 31000 for risk management. It even has guidelines in there for auditing and software life cycles. It is honestly a fantastic reading list for any lab manager who wants to level up their operations. But, and this is a big but, we have to remember that because they are in the bibliography and not in Clause 2, they are purely informative. Let's just cement this core difference right now. Normative equals constitutes requirements. Informative equals helpful context. Think of it this way. An auditor can absolutely write up a nonconformance if a lab ignores a normative reference. But there is no way they can force a lab to comply with a document that's just informative. Understanding this distinction is basically a superpower for anyone trying to navigate the complex world of international standards. Bringing us to our final stop, Section 5, the compliance takeaway, mastering the web of standards. Take a look at this direct quote straight out of Clause 3 of the standard. It says, for the purposes of this document, the terms and definitions giving an ISO/IEC Guide 99 and ISO/ISC 17000 and the following apply. I mean, that right there proves you just cannot interpret the standard without its interlocking foundational documents. If you're trying to define something like metrological traceability using a standard dictionary or worse, your own internal company jargon, you're doing it wrong. You absolutely must use the definitions pulled from those normative references. And that leaves us with a pretty provocative question to wrap up our explainer today. Are you just reading your core standards, or are you actually mastering their normative references too? Because true compliance isn't just about reading the main text, it's about recognizing, understanding, and truly mastering that hidden web of dependencies holding the entire system together. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.